Before I start this video, I'll tell you that this is a look into some of the major factions in the Spanish Civil War and not a lot of the minor factions that also participated on both sides. Hopefully I don't get overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the Spanish Civil War, and with that, let's start the analysis. First, the Nationalists had a wide range of ideologies including, but not limited to, parafascism, phalangists, Carlism, Alphonsism, anti-communism, and others that were united against the Republican government. However, there are a lot of factions within the Nationalists which had different ideologies. Here are some of the main Nationalist factions, but not all, as there were a lot. The Falange were the Spanish fascists and were initially the Falange Española de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista and was founded in 1934, although another Falange faction was founded in 1933 and came into conflict with Spanish Marxists upon being formed. The Falange would merge with the Traditionalist Commune in 1937, creating the FET y de los Jones. The Falange would exponentially grow over the course of the Civil War under Franco's leadership and with the 1937 merger. The Requetés were a Carlist paramilitary militia that was the citizen army that carried out large-scale tactical operations. The Requetés played a major role in Spanish history in the early months of the Civil War when its units were critical for ensuring nationalist advantages on several key frontline sections. The Requetés were usually deployed as shock troops as their tercero casualties were above the average nationalist losses. The Spanish Revolution was a nationalist faction that was a monarchist political party active during the Second Spanish Republic and advocated for the restoration of King Alfonso VIII of Spain as opposed to Carlism. The organization had been linked to the Falange before the Civil War began, and it would be one of the first factions to oppose the Republican government during the start of the Civil War, and it endorsed Franco's leadership. It would also be significantly weakened throughout 1936 and then eventually dissolved in 1937. The Confederación Española de Derechos Autónomos, or CEDA, was a monarchist faction of the Nationalists that initially sought to moderate the Nationalists and Republicans during the start of the Civil War, but the Red Terror in Spain and the constant anti-clerical actions and atrocities carried out by the Republican factions led to CEDA supporting the Nationalists. CEDA would merge into the FET y de los Jones in April of 1937 and be dissolved, with many of its members becoming radicalized by the Red Terror and joining the Falange. The 1936 coup divided the Spanish army, with over half joining the Nationalists. The army brought professionalism and experience to the Nationalist forces for the remainder of the Civil War. The Republican army would see many security forces defections to the Nationalist side in 1936. The Army of Africa was made up of experienced Rift War Moroccan veterans and was instrumental to the Nationalists in the Civil War and Francisco Franco's assumption of supreme command in July of 1936. Thanks mostly to the Army of Africa's advances in Spain, almost all of the Western Territories was in Nationalist hands by the end of September 1936. By early of 1937, the Army of Africa's strength had been increased to 60,000 men. The 1937 Unification Decree was announced to merge the Carlists and Phalangists together as a unified force against the Republicans for the Nationalists. Many monarchist groups would be disbanded and the Falange would increase in strength. The decree, however, didn't really affect the Requeté Terceros as much. Although they were formally incorporated into the Spanish army, they continued to operate as Carlist battalions. Foreign intervention for the Nationalists came from Germany, Italy, and Portugal. The Germans sent the Condor Legion to Spain from July of 1936 to March 1939 with a total of 16,000 German troops. The Condor Legion would see action in the Battle of Jamara, the Vizcaya campaign, Operation Rugen, aka the bombing of Guernica, the Battle of Brunete, and more. It's worth noting that due to the involvement of the international brigades at Madrid in 1936, the Nationalists were distrustful of foreigners, including the Germans. The Italian forces in Spain also not only distrusted, but hated the Germans. Speaking of Italy, the Italians were also present in the Spanish Civil War with the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, which peaked at 75,000 troops, and the Aviazione Legionnaire of planes, which got over 135 flight hours in Spain. Mussolini had preferred for Italian troops to fight for fascism in Spain instead of in a direct war with the Allies or Soviets, as Italy was in no position for a war after the Abyssinia and Libya campaigns. Some notable engagements for the Italian expeditionary forces were at the battles of Malaga, Guadalajara, Santander, Aragon offensive, Battle of Erbo, Catalonia offensive, and the war in the north. Portugal sent the Viriatos Legion of 8,000 to 12,000 volunteers at the start of the Civil War. The Legion was disbanded before any recruitment drive could take place after pro-Republican incidents in Portugal had convinced the government that direct intervention on the side of the Nationalists would cause further unrest. As a result, the Portuguese volunteers enlisted into Carlist militias, the Spanish Legion, Falange, and regular nationalist army units. Portuguese military observation missions with members drawn from all three branches of the Portuguese military were present in Spain from 1936 through 1939, with the dual objectives of protecting the interests of Portuguese volunteers and also collecting information on lessons learned during the Civil War. Other foreign volunteers came from all over the world to fight for the nationalists as the Spanish Civil War became the hub of volunteers to come and fight against all forms of ideologies and fight for all different types of ideologies. For the nationalists, some notable groups that were in the Civil War were the Irish Brigade, which fought at the Battle of Jarama and came to Spain as a reaction to the Red Terror. The Russian All-Military Union had many white Russian veterans fight in the Civil War, and 800 experienced officers from Russia were integrated into Franco's army. There were many other groups which I'm not going to mention, as this video is about major factions in the Civil War. Turning tables to the Republican factions of the Spanish Civil War, there were a wide range of ideologies held by Republican factions that didn't really get along together. I'm of course talking about the purges, but we'll look at those as a case-by-case study when discussing each different faction. First up is the People's Army. The People's Army was the main professional military forces of the Republican government. It was consisted of what remained of the army and most of the pre-war Spanish Air Force and Navy. The army was reorganized by the loyalist forces as the nationalists defected. However, the government would dissolve the army and give the weapons to armed groups and unions. The Air Force and Navy remained mostly loyal to the Republic and remained mostly intact. The Popular Front had a wide range of ideologies ranging from republicanism, liberalism, anarcho-syndicalism, socialism, communism, and a bunch of other stuff in between that varied based on factions. The organization is considered left-wing, but the factions are regarded to have some center-left and far-left leanings. The Popular Front was a recipient of the Loyalist Army's weapons and remained a loose coalition of left-wing groups. The NKVD would take direct charge of purging factions of the Popular Front which did not fall in line with Moscow's policies towards the Spanish Civil War. Next up is the POUM. The POUM was a Marxist, anti-Stalinist, communist group with factions that were libertarian, socialist, and Trotskyist. The POUM suffered from severe shortages in manpower and inadequate equipment. The organization came into conflict with the Popular Front as the POUM was anti-Stalinist and the POUM would be purged by the NKVD and other factions of the Popular Front. The anarchists were an alliance between the CNT and FAI and were well known for taking part in mass lootings and anti-clerical atrocities. The anarchists took part in the fighting in western Spain and were forming a loose alliance with other Republican factions against the nationalists, even though they didn't really agree with one another. The NKVD and the Popular Front would purge the anarchists during the Civil War as part of the Red Terror. The Catalonian nationalists remained loyal to the Spanish Republic, but as the 1936 coup's effects were felt across Spain, anarchists seized control over the Catalonia region. By May of 1937, however, the Catalan governing body had recovered much control over the territory. The Catalonian nationalists would be banned and some were tortured by the Francoist regime in 1939. The Basque nationalists were conservatives who sought their own state in the Basque region, which the Spanish nationalists under Franco were unwilling to concede. The Basque army fought in the Villarreal offensive and the Biscay campaign before surrendering to the Italian troops in Spain under the condition that the industry and economy of the Basque were to remain untouched. The International Brigades were formed in September of 1936 and are attributed to prolonging a fascist victory in 1936 during the Battle of Madrid. Volunteers came from all over the world to fight for both the Spanish Republic and for international communism. They fought in many battles throughout the war and were disbanded after the Battle of the Erbo in 1936. Any members of the International Brigades would be shot by the Nationalists upon being captured, as the Nationalists blamed the International Brigades for dragging on the war until 1939. The International Brigades will get their own video later on as they vary by group, fought a lot of battles during the Civil War, and I just find them very interesting. The most prominent international intervention for the Republicans was the Soviets. The USSR sent thousands of troops to Spain, millions in aid, military equipment, and of course, NKVD officers to do some classic Soviet purging. Many groups of the Popular Front took orders from Moscow, so the Soviets had some level of tactical control over Republican forces during the Civil War. Aside from the Soviets, Mexico, Poland, Greece, Czechoslovakia, and Estonia made arms sales to the Republicans. France also would deliver some planes to the Republicans, and further aid was prevented by factions within internal French politics. $2 million in aid was also sent to the Spanish Republicans by the U.S. for humanitarian purposes. Did you know about all of the factions here that existed and fought within the Spanish Civil War? Are there other factions which I didn't mention because they were just too many and you would like for me to have covered? Feel free to let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.